Welcome into Inside Carolina's Next Level. I'm your host, Tommy Ashley. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt, JohnnyT-Shirt.com. Got Greg Barnes with me and special guest, Bud Elliott. Bud, how you doing?
Guys, I'm doing great. I listen to IC all the time, and I know these Johnny T-shirt reads by heart. I could probably do them as a guy that manages the Pod Network and tries to put out fires when we have them. That you guys do those dudes right.
I have said that so many times. I find myself waking up in the middle of the night going, Johnny T-Shirt, JohnnyT-Shirt.com, East Franklin Street. It's fascinating, but they are great folks. And if y'all are listening to this, you need to go visit them. It's Christmas time. Take care of them as they take care of us. But obviously, you're the big time. So we get the national guys to come on this show with the Next Level with Greg Barnes and I and sort of get a national take outside of the echo chamber that can be the Carolina fan base and the Inside Carolina readership. So we wanted to have you on here to sort of talk about Carolina's standing in all of this. This is very rare and very new for Inside Carolina folks, for Carolina football fans, especially in general. Quite frankly, it's almost surreal that we're sitting here talking about the college football playoff and the college football rankings and Heisman Trophy. Bizarre, I must admit. And I've been doing this and following them for a long, long time. But just overall, from your perspective of where you sit holistically, where does Carolina stand in all of this realistically when you look at the entire landscape?
So I think that they are a solid team that should be in the rankings, probably somewhere I don't know between 8th and like 15th, 17th. If you really wanted to argue, right? Like you could probably go at like high and low as far as your spreads there. I love Drake May. I've been impressed by Carolina's offensive line more than I thought they'd be. And now, of course, because I'm on your show, I'm blanking on the kid's name, but the running back y'all have found is really pretty nice.
Elijah Green.
Yeah, I mean he seems like he's a real deal, and it's hard for me to parse out exactly how much of that is teams having to focus on Drake May and your other Green and Downs and whatnot. But like the offense is super dangerous to me, and the defense is, I think, it's kind of found its level as I would say bad, but not quite as bad as they looked to me in the first month of the season, which was just almost an unplayable level. But you watch the committee's comments, and I'm typically of the mindset that the committee just fakes these rankings week to week to juice the numbers for the TV ratings, and makes for kind of a boring take every week on Cover 3 when we come on there for the reaction show for the playoff odds. Like, okay, why'd they do this? Well, that's the primetime game. All right, well, makes sense. I'm sure they'll get them right in the end, but I don't really think that they follow their own precedent too much on a week-to-week basis, right? I mean, they say one thing in week one, they say a totally different thing in the second rankings and the third rankings. What they seem to value prior to that is disregarded yet again. But I think one of the reasons Carolina is getting dinged right now in the rankings, guys, is typically like a coach in the room, they preach this idea of balance. And I'm against that. I just think like you just need to be a great team. Was that 2019 LSU team the most balanced team we'd ever seen? No, they just had a nuclear offense and a good enough defense. I mean, it's better than this UNC defense, but my point is, I don't like this idea of, we want balanced teams. No, I just want the best teams. I don't really care how they do it as long as they do it.
Yeah, looking at it, and we've heard that. I mean, we've seen Oklahoma be ranked up there and then get raced off the field. Notre Dame did the same. I mean, the idea of balance is confusing to me. But your point about the rankings and how there's a I don't want to say it too unkindly because they're human beings, but there are a lot of what are we doing here moments with the rankings. You guys talk about it a lot. I listen to y'all a ton. Chip is a little bit more exciting than I am, I'll freely admit. But I love Tom and you and Danny. But when you look at the balance aspect of it, 9-1, right? The goal is to win the games, and that's the approach I've taken here. Now it may run out eventually. Hopefully not this weekend when they play Georgia Tech. We'll talk about that later on the Game Plan podcast. But why is that such a thing for the committee to rank these teams and talk about that when, like you said, it sounds it's a lot more than defensive rankings. It's a lot like TV rankings.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think what they're going to look at is basically who you beat and how you beat them, right? And who you lost to and how those losses occurred. So obviously, I mean, Carolina, losing at home to a Notre Dame team that also beat Clemson, to be fair, and has looked better in recent weeks, but at the same time has a loss to what might be the worst Power 5 team in the country at home in Stanford, and also has a home loss to a Marshall team that is not particularly good. Mike Marshall has a Bowling Green loss on its resume, and a couple other ones that don't look too good. And it was a multi-score loss at home, right? I mean, it wasn't necessarily a super close final score, or was it? Yeah, it was like 10 points, right? I think. The rest of the strength of the schedule for Carolina this year, I mean, just go down it. So App looks a little bit worse than it did at the time, right? Because App has kind of fallen off a little bit. Coastal kind of gave it to him a couple weeks ago on that Thursday night or Wednesday night game or whatever that was. Virginia Tech has been bad pretty much the whole season. Miami seems to really have fallen off a cliff. Duke, I think, is a respectable football team, but I'm not sure how much credit the committee is going to give to that. One of my major harps with this committee, guys, is that they arbitrarily draw the line at top 25, which a top 25, by the way, that they make to use to justify where they want to rank these teams that are kind of in that top 10 to 12 to 14, whatever they feel like eventually could get in. And they give you basically no credit if you beat a team that might be 26th or 28th or 34th. And the bottom line here is talk to anybody who makes power ratings, and I make my own, right? I'm literally winning the Golden Nugget Ultimate Challenge right now in the whole country. So, like, I can tell you the difference between 15th and like 40th, it's not even a touchdown in a lot of cases. So, if you got some wins here, like Duke, right? Pitt is not going to be a ranked team. Pitt's still a quality team that you beat. Wake Forest is, I assume, no longer a ranked team. I don't have the rankings right in front of me. They're still a quality football team. North Carolina is having part of the TCU problem right now. A lot of TCU's wins are in that 26 to 40 range, which is still a really quality football team. But because we arbitrarily draw these lines at 25, I mean, maybe because it's a round number, maybe because it used to represent the top quartile of college football teams. Who knows why we picked 25 back in the day, but UNC is kind of getting screwed a little bit just by some of their best wins being just outside that top 25, in my opinion. TCU is kind of having the same problem.
Yeah, along those lines, Bud, we've talked a lot over the years about the NCAA setup and how they've got their fingers all in March Madness, of course, but not so much in football. And I think one of the benefits that the NCAA has established for that sport is they've really kind of worked on this idea of a net tool so that the committee has very specific guidelines of what they're looking for with strength of schedule. And then to your point, they don't just say, hey, it's 1 through 25, 25 through 50. It's, okay, was this game on the road? Was this game at a neutral site? And then they try to classify it as best they can. Is it perfect? No, but it's an attempt to get close to that. Whereas the football playoff committee, they don't have any set metrics that they look at. I found it interesting. Bill Connolly, before the rankings release on Tuesday, was just kind of playing around with formulas with all these different metrics. And he put out the exact same 14 teams in order that the playoff committee laid out. So they're looking at a lot of the metrics too. They're just not saying what they're looking at necessarily.
So I worked with Bill for about 11 years back at SB Nation, when they still did college football, and really, like we talk on Google Chat every day, and what he used there was basically an approximation of the old BCS, right? Which I think I would still have a problem with, because BCS, remember, it kind of took out margin of victory and things that showed dominance. But just to clarify, like, he was using the old BCS computer model to predict what the committee would do, and they actually matched it totally. So Greg, I agree with you. They're looking at something, but they don't really say what they're looking at.
And one thing you said a moment ago, I think hit the nail on the head here, was they're looking at who you beat and they're looking at how you beat them. You mentioned, they've talked a lot, Book Oregon's mentioned it several times, balance. Okay. They want you to be good on both sides of the ball. The other part of it is dominance. They really dinged TCU. I guess it was after the first release a couple weeks ago, and they said, "Look, TCU is playing timely defense, which I think is what we can classify Carolina playing in the last couple weeks, especially late in games." But they said they're not exactly great defensively, and so that's one of the reasons they were a little bit lower on the ranking poll. And kind of to that point, a lot of Carolina fans have looked at strength of record and said, "Well, hey, Carolina's number 11 strength of record, despite being 76 in strength of schedule," which is valid. But then you look at game control, which is effectively how in control of a game you are compared to other teams that it's against like an average opponent, kind of that adjusted premium deal. Carolina's 39th when you're looking at teams like Georgia's number 1, Ohio State's number 3, Michigan's number 4, TCU's number 15. And that's to be expected because Carolina has 6 wins of a touchdown or less. Phil Steele, I don't know if he's kept up with it of late. I hadn't looked at his magazine in a year or two, but he always kept up with the stat of if a team has 4 net wins, meaning they've won 4 more games than lost by 7 points or less, their odds of being better or worse next year is X and X. Well, he only went up to like net 6 because nobody would have more than net 6. Well, Carolina's sitting at net 6 right now. And so in terms of the dominance factor, Carolina just doesn't have it. They had the one game against Pitt where they pulled away late, but the only really dominant game on the schedule was Virginia Tech. And then, of course, North Carolina was getting beat pretty badly by Notre Dame. They're entering the fourth quarter. So I think that plays a lot in the committee's eyes in terms of where North Carolina ranks amongst some of these other teams.
Well, one thing I would point out, and Greg, I agree, and I do look at that. Like, that's one reason I was not very high this year on Michigan State coming in, because I was like, well, what's the chance they hit lightning in a bottle, 2 years in a row with the transfer portal stuff perfectly, and then also what's the chance they win all those close ball games again? But I think it's important to differentiate some of these teams that are having incredible close game fortune, or just close game outcomes that are going in their favor, that are doing so because they are getting a lot of turnover luck relative to like what your expected turnovers are, and teams that are maybe just eking them out. And if you look at it, the teams that typically are winning ball games that are not having a whole lot of turnover luck, but they are better in close games, I liken it to baseball, right? A team that doesn't strike out very much, that's a high contact team. A team that has a really good bullpen is going to win a share of close games that is higher than expected. And to me, Carolina fits that. I mean, I actually don't know who Carolina's kicker is. I probably should, but I assume he's not terrible given how many close games that they've been in. And I do know who Carolina's quarterback is. So in my opinion, it's kind of like quarterback and kicker, right? Are 2 things that late game are going to be really important. So if you're in these close games, and I don't think Carolina has been, have they been lucky a little bit? Sure. I don't think they've been just turnover lucky like some of these teams run.
Yeah, aside from, I mean, Duke missed a late field goal, and Wake Forest, Hartman threw that interception late in that game, and that's a game Wake Forest probably should have salted away. But to your point, Drake May has been the difference in all of them. I mean, that guy's carried the load all year. I mean, for 10 games, really. Even against Notre Dame, he played well. So let me ask you, Carolina's 13 now. They got Georgia Tech. We talked off air about Georgia Tech's struggles. That should be a win. NC State's going to be a different game just because those games are always nasty Friday after Thanksgiving. I mean, it's pretty clear Carolina has to beat Clemson to even continue this conversation. But if they did, Bud, is there any shot? And you've done this for a long time. I personally think there's no shot. I don't see it. But is there a shot and a scenario that Carolina can get to that 4th seed and get to that college football playoff? What do they have to do in these next 3 games, aside from win them, to get there?
Yeah, I think you need to probably smoke Georgia Tech, right? Can't have a game where they're like, hey, guys, even Georgia Tech scored on these dudes, right? And I think that would help in the committee's mind to continue to advance the narrative that defense is improving, which I think it actually is somewhat, to be honest. Even with losing those defensive linemen, which concerned me the last couple of weeks, and they seem to have not I mean, you say not missed a beat, implying that they're good, but like they're not, to my eyes, they're not regressing necessarily after losing those guys up front. I think you clearly need to beat NC State, which, do we know if MJ Morris is going to play for NC State? I don't know if he's playing this weekend. They're 4-point underdogs at Louisville, and that's with a banged up Malik Cunningham. So maybe you want to read into that as you will. I think their center might be dinged too. The depth chart they put out was a little sketch there in Raleigh for my liking. I looked at it, I was like, okay, so everybody's 100% healthy in NC State. Got it. All right, and then you need to beat Clemson for sure. I mean, just if you pull that off, then you need to start comparing some resumes. Clearly, like undefeated TCU is in over them, no doubt. I think Tennessee is probably in over Carolina if they have one loss, right? So that's going to be tough. You need Georgia, I think, to just dispatch of LSU. So Georgia gets in. So those are probably two SEC teams in. I think you need Ohio State to smack Michigan. Because if Michigan takes that big time loss, the rest of their schedule might look a little bit more like sketchy. Like if Ohio State can go and win by 3 touchdowns over Michigan, maybe or 24 or something like that, well, then that's a loss that might be disqualifying for Michigan, because you can look at the rest of the schedule. You can look at the Michigan schedule and say, hey, they shouldn't have canceled that non-conference game and bought out of it against UCLA like they did. And they did. I mean, that was a choice. And now their non-conference schedule looks really poor. So maybe if Michigan gets smacked by Ohio State, or if Illinois springs the upset this weekend, beats Michigan, and Michigan were to also lose in Columbus, that 2 losses, clearly they're not going to go over a 1-loss ACC champion there. TCU, that's a tough one. Like a 1-loss TCU that's a champ might go over Carolina. It might not. It just kind of depends, I think, on how they look and why they lost, right? And in the Pac-12, I think it's as simple as just get yourself a 2-loss Pac-12 champion, which is entirely possible. So all those things sound easy, but like if you had to put a parlay together of all these things that occurring, the odds they're probably less than 1%.
Yeah, the way I kind of look at it, Bud, is all right. So the likely Georgia. I mean, I think we can say they're going to be the prohibitive favorite to win the SEC championship game over LSU. Whoever wins the Big Ten, if TCU wins out, clearly they're going to be in. And I think you can make a case if USC wins out. They've got a little bit better metrics than Carolina, very similar to Carolina. Offense is a little bit better in the defense, while not a lot better, it is better. So I think you can make a legitimate case for those 4 teams if they win their conference championships. My issue, and going back to talking about the arbitrary nature of the committee, is when you look at their criteria, what's number 1 on that list? Championships won. So Tennessee's not even going to play for the SEC championship, and yet I think we all can agree that Tennessee's probably got to step on teams like North Carolina and maybe even a team like USC, who potentially could win. I'll throw Clemson there, of course, who potentially could win a Power 5 championship, but not be able to leapfrog Tennessee, who did not even get to play in their championship game. When that is like the number 1 factor that the committee lays out. I mean, it's on their website. I don't quite get that. I'll have an issue with that if that occurs. I know we've seen it happen before, and it'll happen again. But if you're going to lay out guidelines, stick to them. That's the frustrating part for me.
Do we have the exact language of that? Because I mean, it's been a little while since I've read that. I remember reading it as like if the teams are close or something like that, these are the things to be considered.
If the margins are comparable, the following criteria must be considered: championships won, strength of schedule, head-to-head competition if it occurs, and then the comparative outcomes of common opponents.
They like the way they get around that with Tennessee, Carolina might just be like they don't feel like the margins are comparable. It would be my guess.
Sure.
Ooh, that would be an interesting thing if that happened. If they pull Tennessee, and Tennessee benefits from not even being in their conference championship, that's That's why. Well, I don't know if I like the expansion or not, but anyway, that's another thing. You mentioned Carolina team wise needs Ohio State to blitz Michigan. Uh, let's talk about Drake May for a minute and the Heisman deal. I think the reverse needs to happen for Drake May
Yeah.
to have an opportunity at the Heisman. Your take there?
Totally agree. I took a little CJ Stroud for the Heisman 2 weeks ago, plus 190, just 'cause I realized like the size of the favorite they would be here on out. And I've said on Cover 3 a while, like I think Drake May is the best quarterback in the country. I just don't know if you're going to not give the award to the preseason favorite who leads his team to an undefeated season while throwing for pretty good numbers at Ohio State, right? Like it's, program prestige name type thing. Guy was a preseason favorite. He got all the love. He delivered on the record. With quarterbacks, we seem to reward them for win-loss record a lot, even though that's it's somewhat like obviously their performance has a lot to do with it, but it's not entirely within their control, as Drake May could probably attest, right? Like you got to have other players as well step up around you. But I think Drake May does actually have a shot to win this if Michigan were to beat Ohio State. I do, and I think there's a couple guys that are in that boat as well. I mean, if CJ Corum Blake Corum went nuts on Ohio State and ran for like 250 and 4 touchdowns, sometimes voters can be swayed by late season heroics because he's going to have the numbers as well, and he destroyed Penn State. I think Caleb Williams, by the way, if they run the gauntlet of UCLA, Notre Dame, and then either Utah, Oregon, or Washington back to back to back, like there's really no scenario in which they do that, go undefeated there, and it's not entirely on Caleb Williams because USC's defense is really not very good. And Travis Dye, the running back for USC, is out. I would guess if you watch the video, I mean, I don't know if they've announced it official, but I'd be shocked if he came back this season, unfortunately. I mean, that's going to be a situation where Caleb Williams probably has, 4,200 yards and 50-something combined passing and rushing touchdowns. So he'll have an argument too. I just don't know if it'll be a good enough argument to beat CJ Stroud if the Buckeyes go undefeated.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. I mean, I will give you that. If Caleb Williams is able to do that, and I think he's better. I think if Drake doesn't win it, then I think it needs to be him over CJ Stroud. That I'm not a huge fan of Ohio State football, but Williams is not. I don't vote, so it doesn't matter. But not that. And that's for fan purposes, not players. Those guys are great. But Caleb Williams, Drake May, CJ Stroud in that order, if it shakes out like we've talked about, and Carolina can get by Clemson. What you got, Greg?
Bud, before we let you go, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you a little bit recruiting. The North Carolina fan base, and I think pretty much anybody that follows recruiting across the country has paid attention to your blue chip ratio over the years and kind of the impact of how valuable recruiting is and recruiting at a high level. Carolina has gradually moved up that list. I know they're not quite, I think looking at the one you put out this summer, they're not quite top 15, but they're knocking on the door. Considering that we had you on tonight to talk about Carolina and the potential for a college football playoff and the potential for a Heisman Trophy candidate, how do you think Mack Brown has done recruiting and how that has impacted kind of where he is in terms of program building 4 years in?
I think he's done a great job recruiting. And, Tommy, I know you said you're not sure you're in favor of the expanded playoff, and I certainly understand that. And I think there's some valid points on both sides of it. To me, Carolina is probably never going to be in that sort of Georgia, Ohio State, Bama range where they're recruiting 80% blue chips or higher, right? But they can follow the Clemson model where you get some difference makers at some very key positions, defensive line, corner, quarterback, maybe a stud receiver or two, right? Maybe a blue chip offensive lineman. And you keep everybody healthy, you develop them, you have good culture, and the quarterback that was a stud recruit, he hits. I mean, that's basically what the Clemson formula was for about 10 years there under Clemson. I think Mack's done a pretty good job. I mean, do I have some questions about the defensive coaching? Yeah. Like, I mean, you got a defense that has a good number of 4 and 5 stars on it that, take any metric that accounts for strength of schedule, I think. And Carolina is, just looking here, probably the best is like 95th and the worst is like 114th. So to me, like that's not really acceptable given the amount of defensive 4 and 5 stars recruited. And typically, I will say, defensive performance tracks better with recruiting rankings than offensive performance does. You can kind of scheme your way to offense a little bit more than you can scheme your way to defense. I mean, within reasonable limits, right? And so I'd be a little bit concerned about the level of performance on defense just compared to how well they've recruited. But if you told me Mac had this team in contention for the playoff, I didn't have them going over their win total this year, right? I didn't think that they were going to be that physical on the offensive line. That surprised me. Like that's been quite good. So I think he's doing a nice job there.
Let me ask you a question before I let you get out of here. I've kept you longer than I said we would, but I asked Mac in his Wednesday presser, appearance in the championship or appearance in the playoff, Heisman Trophy. And Mac took it as if you're in the playoff, you've got a chance to win it. That's, of course, bigger than the Heisman Trophy. I agree with that. But appearance in the playoff, get to the semifinals versus win the Heisman Trophy, have a player on your school, on your team win the Heisman Trophy. What's better for a program?
I'm assuming we're asking about this Carolina team this year. I think I would take the playoff shot as I mean, do you really think they wouldn't be competitive at all, given they have Drake and Downs and Green and a line that's blocking pretty well? I think they would score some points on somebody. Like they may give up 50, but they're not going to score 20. Like they'll score mid to high 30s, right?
Right. As Jason Staples says, Drake May gives you a puncher's chance.
Yeah, he does. It really, like Jason's right about that. If you're an NFL team, I'm probably get old takes exposed on this if I'm wrong, but so be it. Would you rather have Drake May or CJ Stroud? Like, guys, Drake May he's a freak show. The throws he makes he plays like within structure enough, and then the stuff he makes when he's just freelancing, that's not normal. Like some of the throws, like the crossbody throw he hit against Pitt when he just run to his left, and he just flicks it like 35 yards downfield on a rope. That's special, man. He's got to be the preseason favorite for Heisman next year. Him and Caleb, I would think, assuming Bryce and CJ go pro. Unless I'm missing somebody here.
Somebody will pop up.
But I mean, like preseason favorite wise, it's going to be those two. I would assume.
How do you think Josh Downs is on the next level? He's a little fella, but he's tough.
Yeah. I think he's going to do well. I mean, he's just always been like seeing him play for Tony's 7-on team too. He's a guy that I feel like losing matters to him. And I like guys like that, right? Like I like guys when they're not playing for something, they're still pissed off when things don't like when their team doesn't win, right? And just some random 7-on just trying to get better on a weekend. I like guys that when it matters to them, if the team they're playing on loses, and he competes for the ball really well, even though he is small. He has good hands. He doesn't have a ton of drops, and he finds ways to get open too. I think he'll do well, guys.
Yeah, ask him today. Phil Longo said earlier in the week there are plays where he needs to stay covered. So I asked Josh. I said, how do you feel about being a decoy, basically? And he don't like it. He says his job's to get open, but he understands that sometimes I guess I got to be the decoy. But yeah, you talking about 7-Eleven open all day, open 24/7. I mean, he is unbelievable. Speaking of 24/7, Bud Elliott, CBS Sports, Cover 3. It's a great podcast. If you don't listen to the Inside Carolina podcast every day like you should be, listen to the Cover 3. Those guys are great. Danny Cannell, Tom Fernelli, and Chip Patterson. Got to get more Carolina talk on there, Bud. Y'all got to do
it. We try to get some, and we give Chip hell for having the same haircut as Boo Corrigan. So the playoff chair, that's
that is hilarious. Is it a hair? No, I'm not going there. It's been fun. I was going to pick on him. It is always a pleasure to talk to you, my man. That's Greg Barnes. I'm Tommy Ashley. It's been Inside Carolina's Next Level, sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt, JohnnyT-Shirt.com. We'll be back next week with another special guest. Take care.